Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander F., and today we are so excited to talk about astrology and the occult in the Twelver Shi Hadith corpus with Dr. Amina Inloes. And listeners, in addition to pushing the boundaries of esotericism in the Islamic tradition, Dr. Amina Inloes is no stranger to the podcast. She is a scholar, a researcher, an educator, a public speaker, and a translator with a PhD in Islamic Studies from the University of Exeter in the UK on Shia Hadith about pre-Islamic female figures mentioned in the Holy Quran. And I know, listeners, as so many of you are familiar with, in 2021, Dr. Inloes, along with talismanic artist Jay Hamedi, presented a select translation of for the first time in English, of the first 8 chapters of the Sun of Knowledge, or the Sun of Gnosis, which in Arabic is the Shams al-Ma'arif, as well as excerpts from other chapters from the original Arabic. So today, we're super excited for many reasons, but we are going to be delving deep into Dr. Inloes' latest research into astrology and the occult and occult curios, if you will, in the Twelver Shi Hadith corpus. And with all that being said, to help us uncork the uncommon, Dr. Amina Inloes, thank you so much for stopping by the podcast again today.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm very excited about this for a couple reasons. First, your podcast is awesome, and I always enjoy listening to it and the variety of subjects, the guests you have on. So thank you very much for having me back. But also I'm excited to talk about this subject because, quite frankly, it's a bit of a niche subject. And I oftentimes have to sell people on it because they kind of be like, well, what's there to talk about in Hadith and astrology, Hadith, what's going on? So sometimes I have to push it a little bit. So I think it's absolutely wonderful that you want to talk about it for a whole podcast.
Oh my goodness, the honor is absolutely mine, Dr. Inloes. Are you kidding me? It's an honor to have you on, and I totally agree. I think, it's so funny. We talk about the occult, and occult just means hidden. And so I think you and a very select few other scholars and researchers, you're bringing so much to light. And yes, I'm excited to chat about astrology and the occult in the Twelver Shi Hadith corpus. And I guess some listeners, probably the best place to start, Dr. Inloes, is so many listeners out there might be familiar, with maybe Islam or Ruhaniyyah, Islamic esotericism. But can you give us kind of the broad strokes on, what is Twelver Shiism? What is that all about? And anything you think the listeners would need to know would be great.
So let's take 1,400 years and compress them.
Yes, indeed.
I don't find the formal definitions are really all that helpful. I could sit here and give you all a historical overview. Twelver Shiism is a branch of Islam. Sunni Islam is the majority branch. Shiism in general is a minority branch and always has been. With respect to the Twelver Shi tradition, there is considerable overlap with Sunni beliefs and practices. As a very general statement, I know someone's going to start picking into this, but as a very general statement, Twelver Shiism is oftentimes characterized by having a balance between the esoteric and the exoteric. So on the one hand, there is a very strongly developed tradition of studying Islamic law and these things, but also a lot of the contents of the core texts, such as the prayers, or as we're going to talk about today, Hadith, which are quotations attributed to the Prophet Muhammad and luminaries. I finally found the word that works. Luminaries. So that might be people around the Prophet Muhammad, or in the Shi'i tradition, there's 12 Shi'i tradition, there's 12 leaders after him, who Hadith are taken from, which can sound very weird to Sunni Muslims if they're not familiar with that, but they are, for all intents and purposes, part of the Hadith collection. So that does distinguish the 12 Shi'i Hadith collection. So it's collections of quotations from, yes, the Prophet Muhammad, the Imams, and important people around them. So that's what Hadith are. Back to Twelver Shiism. So oftentimes it's described as having a balance between, or a well-developed exoteric and esoteric side. A lot of the beliefs and practices are not too different from Sufism, which again is a very broad topic. Shiism in particular emphasizes visiting the shrines of, where the Prophet Muhammad is buried, in the shrines of the Imam. So that's a very active practice. One of the practices that does make it somewhat distinct from other branches of Islam, which is oftentimes what it's known for. I'm sure if you Google it, this is probably what will come up, is there is a very strong practice of ritual lamentation for religious martyrs. And so, there's a lot of sad poetry, sad recitations, wearing black. Someone I know says we do Saturn remediation. I don't know if that's what we're doing or not, but I never really thought about that too much until I was talking with some people about ancient Greek traditions and the PGM, and we were talking about the links between this and other ancient cultures, which, I was aware it was and is, but especially it was a common custom in ancient Greece and also Mesopotamia, and it's just sort of carried over and adapted to the religious tradition as things do. But it is something that is very strongly practiced today, which I think some people who are not familiar with it, but who are familiar with the ancient customs, might be actually surprised to see it as a very strong live custom. There are people who memorize the stories of the martyrdoms and you recite, you want to make people cry. That's the goal. And so that's part of the spiritual practice and tradition. There's probably a lot more I could say. Do you have any questions?
No, this is absolutely fantastic, Dr. Inloes. The question that I know might be on the mind of a few listeners would be, and you'll do a far better job than I am at this summation, is when it comes to Shia Islam, this is after the passing of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, there were the four righteous caliphs. And the fourth caliph was Ali. And can you share a little bit about how those lamentations and specifically the connection to the family of the Prophet is through Ali, and this is one of the main thrusts that is historically in the development of Shia Islam. That was really clumsy. Can you please clarify for that?
Of course. It's all about Imam Ali. Well, and it's about the Prophet too, but there is a very strong focus on Imam Ali in Shiism, which again is common in Sufism as well. For those who aren't familiar with him, he's renowned for many things. He was a warrior, a spiritual figure, a statesman, a sage, very learned. He's considered to have originated a number of branches of thought, in the Muslim heritage at a very pivotal time. So he's all around very spectacular in many ways. In fact, I actually find it difficult to speak about him because there's just so much to pick from. It's a bit easier to talk about someone who's more limited in their expertise. But definitely he has a very central role in Shiism. With respect to lamentation ceremonies, two of the main ones are the martyrdom of Imam Ali. When he was caliph, or the leader of the Muslims, he was assassinated at the time of the dawn prayers. He was going to the mosque to lead them, and someone sworded him, as they did in the past. So that was that. We should do that in the month of Ramadan. And then also the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, which is the Prophet Muhammad's grandson. He and his companions were rather brutally killed rather than giving allegiance to a leader who they thought was unjust. And they felt this would basically destroy the society. So they refused and they were killed one by one. And that's still commemorated today. Again, Shiis are not the only people who observe these things, especially historically. Seems to be of less sectarian divisions, but one can say there's a special focus and vigor, especially among Twelver Shis.
That's a beautiful summation, Dr. Inloes. Thank you. And in terms of your research, how this connects to your wonderful research, which I know listeners are going to love. So let's jump right into it. So the Twelver Shi Hadith corpus, as you said, is of course a collection of sayings from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, but also luminaries, by the way. I love that use that you employ of the word luminaries. And something that you mention in your research is that, quote, the Twelver Shi Hadith corpus is significantly more favorable towards astrology than the Sunni Hadith corpus. Can you share a little bit about why is this? Why is this the case?
It's a good question. I have a few suggestions on it. Briefly speaking, for those who haven't looked through these materials, the Sunni Hadith corpus does not discuss astrology very much. And when it does come up, it's in a negative light. And many people will know what I'm talking about. I've seen it quoted on Twitter/X and so forth. The Shi'i Hadith corpus is quite different. I don't know exactly how much material there is on astrology. But I would say that if we have a book, looking for a book to demonstrate with here, I mean, we are talking of what might be potentially hundreds of pages of material. So there is a lot of material. And that was actually my first challenge when finalizing this article on astrology and Twelver Shi Hadith is you can't talk about everything. You have to talk about something. So why is it more and why is it treated better? One of the reasons is chronological, because Shi'i Hadith are taken from the Imams, who lived about 250 years after the Prophet Muhammad. That was the time when astrology became a learned science in the Muslim world. And also, the tradition of Islamic astrology began to flourish, or was flourishing. That's when we start to hear about the classical Islamic astrologers that you might hear about on this or other podcasts. It doesn't seem like in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, in the Arabian Peninsula, which is where he was from, it doesn't seem like the sort of sophisticated zodiacal astrology that you find in ancient Greece or in Persia and so forth. It doesn't seem like that was common there. Now, I'm not going to say no one ever did it because that would be a sweeping statement. It's possible someone did, and I suspect that possibly there might have been pockets of Jewish communities which might have had their own astrological condition. There's no evidence I'm aware of for this, by the way. Might be evidence, but I'm not aware of it. And it's just a speculation on my part. But it doesn't seem like that form of astrology, which is what we usually call it today, was known or was done in the society at the time. There was a traditional sort of astrology with their own, it had its own cultural roots in the Arabian Peninsula, their own sky map and their own situation, but that's quite different to what was done later. So because the Shi'i Hadith collections do extend over this longer period of time, and that's when astrology began to take off, especially in the courtly life and among the elite, and we're talking about the translation movement and so forth, it's natural that some people would come to the Imams and have questions about it. Or, and this is a key impetus in a lot of Shi'i Hadith, one of the beliefs you do find in Shi'ism is that the Prophet Muhammad and the Imams, they know everything that can be known. This is emphasized in Shi'ism, whereas Sunnis might have more of a variety of views about it. And this tends to include most everything that's knowable, the past, the future, and certainly any form of learning. They just simply may choose not to do it. Or, for example, they might not necessarily evade death because they understand it's their time to go. But it's not that they didn't know about it. So, because of this, there's also a push for them to demonstrate their knowledge of astrology, which was one of the measures of learning at the time. So that might be another reason. And I have some other ideas as well, but those are probably the most obvious and agreed upon reasons.
That's fabulous context, Dr. Inloes. Thank you. And to that very point, in your research, in your article, and in your excellent ability to really contextualize this, you trace out almost different strains of thought in the Twelver Shi Hadith corpus that initially you say, when you look at it, initially it appears to present conflicting or different views on astrology, but you so usefully divide the Hadith corpus into three different areas. Ancient Arabian astrology in the age of Jahiliyyah, if you will, pre-Islam, esoteric astrology, and then the Islamicate mathematical astrology. And you do this in such a great way to organize and explain these differences. Can you just trace out some of the broad strokes about roughly these three different categories and how they're different, but how they're also related to each other? Would be great.
Of course. So starting with the first category, which I called ancient Arabian astrology, that might be a little bit of a misnomer, but it does refer to the practices prior to Islam found in the Arabian Peninsula, which frankly, as historians and researchers and archaeologists and so forth, we don't have a lot of solid evidence about. A lot of what we know, those of you listening, I'm putting little quotes in the air here. We know, it comes from later Muslim sources who might have had a certain polemical agenda to separate Islam from the past. So, one thing that has emerged now that there's more contemporary archaeological research in the Arabian Peninsula is that what's actually been found is not exactly what people were writing down, say, in the 9th or 10th century, which is a couple hundred years after the advent of Islam. That's also an issue with these hadith. To keep in mind, there's always an authenticity question with hadith. They're attributed quotations to important people. I take the stance in the articles that this isn't a very big deal because if they're attributed to important people in classical works, they reflect some sort of dominant stream of thought in the community. So whether or not the particular person who said them, they're saying something about people's conceptions of that person. So they're representing a legitimate idea, if you will. And maybe that's all we ever leave behind in life anyway, a legitimate idea of who we are and what we stand for. Anyway, so someone pointed out to me after I explained to him this categorization eagerly that it does seem that some of the hadith material, and I would include the Sunni hadith corpus here, even though I know I'm going to get flamed for this by some people, but it seems like some of the stuff talking about quote-unquote astrology during the Jahiliyyah time may actually have been written, say, in the 9th century or so, as part of the reaction against the, more quotes, foreign sciences. That is to say, when philosophy began to become Greek philosophy began to spread in the Muslim world, there were some people who didn't like it, that they felt it's going to do things to you. And so it may be that these texts are more of a reaction to that, and they're not actually a historical statement about what people actually did. And in particular, I think one of the things we tend to think about it is star worship in ancient Arabia because it just comes to mind. And certainly from a classical perspective, I could see that being part of the tradition. But I would point out that that is speculative in terms of what we have actual evidence for. What we have actual evidence for is people using the stars for agriculture, for navigation, for timekeeping, for the normal sorts of things you do. Apologies. The normal sorts of things you do, especially when you live in the desert and have good sky views most of the time. So these markers are found in inscriptions and so forth, but I don't think we've really got solid evidence, inscriptions and so forth, actually linking star worship to the gods. But it seems like a reasonable speculation, and certainly that's what the later Muslim authors said. So I did make a mention of that. But in any case, there is an idea that, somehow what was going on in the past was superstitious or linked to beliefs outside of Islam or whatever it was. And that's, can I digress?
Yes, please.
Okay. And that's actually the main thing you see in the Sunni Hadith corpus. There's a narration from the Prophet Muhammad saying that whoever learns astrology has learned a branch of magic. Yeah, fighting it.
Interesting.
And now I want to say about that, first of all, as a statement, like, which we can say is true or false, I believe it's a true proposition, if you will, or it can be true. Like, you look at people who do astrology today, some of them, they wouldn't touch magic,
Oh, yes.
None of this.
None of the you are holding up a copy of the Summa Sacra Magice with Dr. Skinner. Yes.
Yeah. They're very rational about their practice, and maybe the planets send out rays to the earth or whatever. And then you have the astro magic clubs. But in any case, from a historical perspective, you see the same thing. There's people who practice astrology and who don't appear to be magically inclined. They're more mathematical, observational, and so forth. And then there are people who are very much magically inclined, and that's why we have that tradition. And certainly, astrology is an inherent part of the Arab Islamic occult tradition. So what I'm getting at is, as a statement reflecting the classical heritage, I would say it's true. I don't personally believe it's a correct attribution to the Prophet Muhammad. And that's simply because it doesn't seem like astrology was a big deal around him. So why would he be telling people about it? The only examples of magic that we have from his time, recorded examples anyway, it's the magic through the tying of knots, amulets, talismans, these things. And I'm not saying, maybe they connected them to the stars rising or the moon or something. But the point is, we don't actually have records of astral magic there. So that's why I'm skeptical of this. But I've decided, I had a section on this in my paper, but I was asked to delete it on the grounds that it's not about Shi'i Hadith. So fair enough. This, to my knowledge, the statement is not present in the Shi'i Hadith corpus, which is interesting in and of itself, given how prevalent it's become just in the sort of Islamic consciousness. But maybe I'll dedicate a separate paper to that some other time. But that's sort of the astrology thing. And that is not very well represented in the Shi'i corpus. There was something else I deleted from my paper because someone told me to, and I really should have done it. But there is one hadith which is, it's negative about the astrology, and it condemns a bunch of other things, I can list them all out, but they're all things that Shi'is do, like in our ritual practice, like the wailing, the ritual lamentation. And, we have a discussion about that and why it's religiously legitimate in some, in the religious context. But nonetheless, it's just kind of weird to look at it like that. I'd be like, well, okay, whatever you say. But in any case, that's, group one, which is not the big group in Shi'i Hadith. Then we get to what's called esoteric astrology. Now, this was actually called esoteric Shi'ism in my original draft, but once again, I was asked to change it because someone said, well, Shi'ism is esoteric anyway, which I'm not sure I entirely agree with, because certainly like laws for ritual washing and stuff is not usually very esoteric. I mean, it can get that way if someone's inclined to interpret it that way, but I wouldn't say everything is esoteric. But so I changed it to esoteric astrology. This is it appears to be chronologically an intermediate group, and by that I mean at least the historical memory is chronological. I'm not saying what people actually did at certain times, and that is to say there's kind of a blend between the person of the Imam, because right now we're past the prophetic era. And in Shiism, the Imam is what is known in Islamic philosophy as the perfect man or the perfect human, Insan al-Kamil. That is to say, they're not only perfected in all aspects, there's sort of a link to the spiritual realms, just a pillar upholding the cosmos and so forth. So there's a heavy role given to this person. And this is something which is believed the Imams, a role that is believed the Imams held. In any case, this is where astronomical and astrological things start to blend with the conception of the person of the Imam having this cosmological role. And keeping in mind, this is during the time when cosmologies, which did fuse the physical with the heavenly, also, I think, started to solidify. So the idea, like the Quran talks about seven heavens, but no one's ever really completely agreed about about what they are. But we start to get the idea of the celestial spheres. So, maybe the angels are up there by the planets or something. So there's this blurring of what's physical and material and what's elsewhere. And some of this is done through astrological discussions, which can get a little bit lengthy. But again, they tend to involve somehow the spiritual status or, if you will, miraculous capabilities of the imams. That's a group too. And that's sort of a weird group that doesn't persist, but it is there. And then we get to the quote-unquote Islamicate mathematical astrology, and that's basically what people are talking about when they talk about astrology today. So you've got a 12 equal zodiac signs. You have the typical zodiac signs, or I should say the normal ones we use today in the West or in Indian astrology. Because keeping in mind, the ancient Arabs did not have the 12 equal signs. Their sky map, they had signs of types, but they were quite different. And that's a fascinating subject in and of itself. It just seems that their ancient way of doing things went away for whatever reason after Islam spread, and things happened, Greek philosophy and so forth. So you've got the 12 zodiac signs, and basically the techniques that we're familiar with, and natal charts, electional charts, horror astrology, asking questions of the astrologer, and the sort of, basically all the things that we would see today, except for Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto, and asteroids, and so forth. And that's the bulk of what's dealt with in the tradition.
That's absolutely incredible. Thank you for sketching that out, Dr. Inloes. And for those three categories, I know that we were talking about some questions that go into each of these categories, but I'm just going to turn it over to you, because if there's any part of a hadith or a specific example that you'd like to give that maybe illustrates this, I think listeners would absolutely love it. Some of the things, just very quick, that I had written down was, in one of the hadiths that you share, it links Saturn, the planet Saturn, with the first Shiite Imam, Ali. So that's absolutely fascinating. There's another hadith that you share. Many listeners are familiar with the Enochian or Enochian magical techniques and Enoch or Idris. And there's a hadith talking about Enoch being identified as the primal astrologer or the father of astrology. I mean, there's so many different examples that you give, but is there anything that comes to mind that you think might that could illustrate, or maybe a hadith that you're like, oh my gosh, this is such a fascinating example? I mean, anything and everything. I think listeners would love it.
Let's start with Saturn. I
Great.
placed this in my esoteric astrology category, but again, these are my categories. Someone might disagree. There's a discussion between one of the imams, Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, and someone from Yemen. And this is a long text, so I'm not going to read it all out loud. And that's another distinguishing feature of Shi'i hadith. They can be quite long. When you look at the Sunni hadith, they're usually short, a few lines, or maybe a paragraph or so. But you can get stuff that's like 50 pages long in the Shi'i tradition, for reasons. Anyway, this is a discussion between an astrologer from a family of astrologers who came from Yemen to meet Imam Sadiq, probably in Medina, in the Arabian Peninsula. So they talk a bit. The person from Yemen is surprised because the Imam knows his birth name. But of course, we understand the Imams know all things. So it's letting us know that the Imam knows behind the scenes of things. Then they have to start talking about the stars, and they're talking about how bright the stars are. In terms of luminosity, and the Yemeni man isn't able to answer that, like how much more bright is Venus than Mercury, and so forth. You go on a bit at length, not to be disrespectful, just saying that. And then there's a reference to one of the rising stars with respect to bovine reproductive cycles. And that's linking a bit more to the what we find in the quote unquote astrology zone. Just because one of the things we do know is that the rising stars were used to time animal behavior and planting and weather and so forth. So he's asking about something from the earlier tradition. So that's us saying this is a bit of an intermediate zone. We've got some mixing. Once again, he doesn't know that. Then the Imam asks the person from Yemen, what kind of star is Saturn? A star here could mean star or planet. So the person from Yemen says, an inauspicious star. And the Imam says, say this not. It is the star of the commander of the faithful, which is a name for Imam Ali, and the star of his inheritors. And then he connects it to an ayah of the Holy Quran, and Najm Thaqib, the piercing star. So he's linking this interpretation to the Holy Quran. Then they keep talking, and we can go back to Saturn, but I'll just finish the framework here. They have a discussion at the end, where Imam Sadiq is asking the person from Yemen about the learned ones in Yemen. And by this, we understand it's not only book learning, but also a sort of spiritual or mystical learning. And the person from Yemen brags, and he says, in an hour, one of these learned people can travel as far as a fast rider can in a month by tracking and auguring the birds. So he's using traditional means of doing things. And then the Imam says there's someone in Medina, probably referring to himself, more knowledgeable, because even without tracking or auguring the birds, he can travel as far as the sun does when it traverses the 12 constellations or houses, and 12 lands, and 12 seas, and 12 worlds. We don't really know what the 12 lands, the 12 seas, and the 12 worlds are. If I can go a little bit modern here, it sounds like he's astral projecting to other planets. But he's doing something anyway. And then the person from Yemen is very impressed. So that's the gist of it.
Wow, that's incredible. So here we have the astrological aspects, of course, with Saturn, as you say, right there at the seventh heaven, the known boundary of all the wandering stars at the time. And then you have this linkage within the person of and the role, the first Imam of Ali, and you have this just wonderful dynamic that it seems to be, Dr. Inloes, and this might be too much of a stretch, so please correct me, but you're right. Like reading your excellent research, it's like the Shi'i Hadith corpus has this just beautiful treatment, almost a redemptive aspect of astrology, and like really taking it out of this is forbidden, this is not to be ever practiced, to something that is engaged with and it is a reality in the historical time. Would that be somewhat fair?
Yes, except I would also contextualize that by saying I don't think there were that many people going around in, say, the 8th century that this is forbidden. Don't touch this.
Yes.
I think that's much more of a modern thing. I mean, if you keep in mind, most, if not all, of the big Muslim empires had court astrologers who had very important positions. But all that stopped with the establishment of the modern nation states and spread of secularism and so forth. So I think a lot of the discomfort with astrology today is heavily tied into the attempts to scientize Islam, to divest it of anything that might sound quote unquote backwards or superstitious, to keep up with the West, and to fit into the modern secular model. And it's worth remembering too, that nowadays we take things like time for granted. We're both able to show up here at the same time, despite being on different continents. Because it's, something that's digitized and standardized. But of course, even in our own younger years, it wasn't entirely like that. You might be off a few minutes here or there. And certainly you go back a couple hundred years and you need the astronomer/astrologer, because it tended to be the same person, to actually be marking the months, marking the years. And of course, in the Islamic world, you tend to have multiple calendars going. So you've got the Islamic lunar calendar, which is the one used for religion. Yeah, and it's also been used in daily life, but some places also have their own solar calendars, and they might be matching to the Western calendar. So that is a very skilled and learned job, especially if you're doing it observationally. But these are things that have gone in our era. So I think these are reasons why there is this sort of attempt to push astrology out of the Islamic heritage, whereas it seems like it was fairly common among people and the learned classes in the earlier eras. I mean, certainly there was a big flourishing during the Abbasid Empire, which is around the time that we're talking about. But yeah, Saturn, it's been interesting how Imam Ali is connected to Saturn. And I wish I had more to say about that. Imam Ali is seen as a father figure, if you will. But I wrote another paper. Can I advertise?
Absolutely, please.
Yeah, this actually isn't, I don't tend to push my own work, and this is one I actually don't push. I just figure anyone who finds it will find it. But it's about masculine and feminine archetypes in Shiism in light of certain archetypes in the ancient world surrounding certain deities. Now, this is a sensitive subject, hence my hesitation here. Just because one of the allegations against Shiism, basically by Sunnis, is that you're not real Muslims, or this is like Zoroastrianism that's put into Islam, or it's, I don't know, paganism that's put into Islam. Now, that's not going to bother most listeners here, but that's what's said. And unfortunately, this sort of rhetoric is used to encourage violence towards Shi'is. There is a lot of killing. I mean, mosques get blown up. ISIS, for example, used to target Shi'is. And so that this is an issue which has real ramifications. So I want to be gentle with it. But of course, as much as Muslims might like to think that Islam is somehow separate from the past, it's not. It grew up in the past. And I mean, all Muslims who know something about Islam do know there's things from the past that came into Islam. Like, we know that the Kaaba in Mecca, that they used to circle around it in the past, and then they circle around it in Islam too. I mean, there's some differences in how we do it. But it's an ancient custom. But in any case, I'm looking at this, you could say, a bit more from a psychological, archetypical perspective. And I look at one goddess in particular from North Africa, and the archetypes linked with her. And I compare it to our portrayals of Fatima Zahra, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad. For she's presented as like the ideal woman. So she's the role model female, if you will. And Imam Ali is the role model male. We don't have anything else like gender complicated among these two. They're polarized. And then some of that polarization does also reflect other archetypes, like solar and lunar archetypes and so forth, night and day, etc. So if you're interested in reading more about that, and to be honest, it is more about Fatima Zahra and less about Imam Ali, but I did include a section on him for a little bit of balance. It's on my academia.edu page. But getting back to it, the point is he is seen as a sort of father figure. And to my understanding, although I don't think I mentioned this in the article, I think that the ancient Arabs, or I've heard at least, they used to look to Saturn as the father figure, if you will. And I'm not sure how established this was. And the thing is with mythologies, like, we don't necessarily have to take them literally. I think a lot of us would agree that's been one of the errors of modernity. They say Zeus did this or that. Greeks, how did they believe Zeus did that? It's not that necessarily this is literally what people believed, but it's sort of an idea that helped them to understand the world. So there may be some tie-in there. Of course, the characteristics of Saturn do fit Imam Ali quite well. He's known for being very wise. And although he was very fair and compassionate, he was also very authoritative and very stern. In fact, one of the things that's said is in Shiism, is when you die, the first thing you see is Imam Ali. He's going to see you after you're dead. And if you're heading the right way, you've had a decent life, you haven't been doing the kind of things that go on the news and so forth, that then, he's very radiant and glowing, and it looks very nice. And if you have not been doing the right things, tyranny, mass murder, etc., then he's this terrifying figure. So there's that association with death too. I don't know. Why do you think Imam Ali is associated with Saturn?
No, this is so great, Dr. Inloes. You have my brain turning now because I'm also thinking of Saturn, of course, being the traditional in esotericism, the governor of the sphere of lamentations, sorrow, death, as you say. So when I think about Imam Ali, but also the family of Imam Ali and all of the Shiite traditions on lamentations and wailings and really embodying specific moments in history and really resonating with the grief and the sorrow, maybe that also might be a connection?
That's a good point also.
Interesting. Okay, can I have a permission as well to deviate with you a little bit because this question just popped into my head, and so I'll throw it out there, but feel free. So when you mentioned that some of the hadith or some in the tradition, for instance, when the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, "Whoever learns astrology is learning a branch of magic." That term magic, something that I know you and I have discussed, but also previous guests, Dr. Liana Saif, Professor Sayed Ahmed, others have talked about, and this is a total false dichotomy on my part, so feel free to break this apart. Like in Islamic esotericism, on the one hand, you have Sihr, this concept, seen in like the second chapter of the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, with Harut and Marut, and you have Sihr, this kind of carries tendencies of like negative connotations in a way. Yeah. Think about Surah Al-Falaq with, save me from the mischief, min nafathati fil uqid, so the women who blow on knots. But on the other side, you have this concept of Ruhaniyyah and like Quranic theurgy and almost permissible. So I guess the question is, in the Shi'i Hadith corpus, when the word magic comes up, is it treated as Sihr? Is it treated as Ruhaniyyah? Is it somewhere in between? Does it depend? I don't know.
That's a good question. And of course, the word magic doesn't come up because that's an English word with modern connotations. And maybe that's really the root of the issue. I think, and this is in another article that I wrote that we might have time to discuss, Occult Curios in Twelver Shi Hadith. I've collected a lot of material that by modern, not actually a lot, it's like a selection of material that by modern standards would seem to be about, quote, magic or, quote, the occult. But this is really a very modern view because basically anything that's not empirical or material and doesn't have a material cause and effect is magical or maybe miraculous or something. But it's a very broad category, but that wouldn't have been so in the past. So, for example, some people would have classified astrology closer to the natural sciences. Making a talisman for healing might have been, that's definitely part of the traditional medical practice. And by that, I mean what's called the prophetic medicine. Sometimes nowadays they call it Greek medicine. No, but it's you basically use a lot of stuff to treat. So you might do herbs, you might do cupping. Cupping. You might do exorcisms, you might have prescribed prayers, you might write a talisman or an amulet and so forth. So this is about medicine and it's not about magic. Exorcisms, at least through prayer and recitation of Quran, it's not magic. It's just part of the tradition of things that were done. So yeah, what actually comprises Sihr is, it's vague, and this is not just an issue that we're having. I mean, certainly there's authors from many centuries ago who also said this is actually a very difficult term to define. But I think that the gist of it in general is deception to gain an end. Making something seem other than what it is for nefarious reasons, or just malefica that's like not for the sake of invoking divine justice on people, cursing your neighbor because you don't like them or something. So that's the general idea, but yeah, it is quite unclear. But I would say a lot of this doesn't really fall under the rubric. It doesn't appear to fall under the rubric of Sihr in the tradition. It's a complicated situation, at any rate.
Yeah, love that. Love that. Thank you, Dr. Inloes, because you're right. It's one of the things your research and your articles, and again, listeners, check the links below because we will link to all of the ways that you can not only support Dr. Inloes, but also check out her latest research and articles, anything that's publicly available.
I want to add on the point of Sihr.
Oh no, please, please. This is great. This is great. Go for it.
No, I do want to point out that in my opinion, you do find people who are terrified of Sihr. And I'm not saying that there isn't good cause. Their mother-in-law might be doing Sihr on them. It happens. But the number one kind of Sihr we have today is the mass media. And by that, I would also include social media nowadays. There are people who spend tons of money to get themselves in power, to stay in power, to get their political agenda, to start a war. So you're killing thousands, tens of thousands of people. And nowadays, we've got bots going online to try to encourage people to have one political perspective or another, or put their money in this or that. I mean, this to me is Sihr in a literal sense. It is the deception, and using an illusion to change the world. I mean, you get someone who's sitting in a cave writing talismans. That's really nothing compared to the way the systems we have today of the mass media and social media, especially with artificial intelligence, can be deployed to actually create substantial change in the world. Perhaps that's something the tradition might be alluding to, if you are someone who might think that people who are talking about these things might have had a future premonition.
That is such a great point, Dr. Inloes. One of the things, just to digress and add to your point, that I speak with a few guests, either scholars or practitioners, is when you look at the grimoires or the Shamsa Ma'arif, when you look at any, Ahmed al-Buni, when you look at any of the writings, fasting is always prescribed, of course. One must fast and pray for X number of days. And, but one of the fasts today that we need, many people brought up, is a social media fast and a digital fast.
True.
Would you agree with that? Do you do that especially someone so busy as a scholar? Do you also find you have to kind of step back a little bit from that?
I definitely control it. I tend to leave my phone in airplane mode unless there's an emergency going on. And I do understand that there are times when people need to get a hold of you. But when I was 6 years old, people got a hold of each other without the mobile phone. So I understand not everyone can do that. And it annoys people when I do that. But for me, I do need to disconnect. With the internet, it's not only the way it affects our thinking and as a distraction. And nowadays, again, with the advertising and the artificial intelligence, we're just getting stuff fed to us to try to get us to consume the way they want us to consume. But I have to come to appreciate how much, there is definitely an energy exchange with the internet. And I feel like, if I'm not starting to sound all new agey here, it's like this giant thing, and it can just suck your energy out of you when you're looking at it. In a sense, you are feeding the machine. And, I'm not saying it's all necessarily evil, and we wouldn't be having this discussion without the internet. And I've discovered all sorts of wonderful things and wonderful people online. But I do feel there is also that energy exchange. And when I cut off from it, I do feel I have a lot more vitality and clarity of thought. And that's certainly given me some pause for thought with respect to how I use it.
No, that's so great. I remember growing up in the late 80s and in the 90s, mid 80s. And yeah, when I go on a social media fast, at the very end of the fast, whether it's a week or whatever it is, I'm like, oh, this is how people used to live in the 1990s and in the late 80s. It's almost like going in a time machine,
Yeah. And, despite, I probably shouldn't say this given my job, but despite the fact that I do work in an academic job, I do feel like my ability to concentrate on a whole book was a lot higher in the past. And I think in part that's just because we read so much, you get WhatsApps and you get telegrams and this and that, and you're just reading, and very low quality reading too. And I think when we just had less text but more to focus on, it was easier to really engage with it.
100%. It's great. It's a very important point, listeners. So I hope you appreciate that as much as I do as well. And Dr. Inloes, too, one of the things I love about our discussion here, and really all of the listeners who I know are hearing you right now, is true esotericists, even researchers, they love the breaks, the social media fast, and going into the tradition. And one of those traditions that you were touching on earlier is this figure in the Hadith tradition. Someone I know many listeners are familiar with is Enoch or Idris. And what I love about this is so many listeners know, of course, you think of, Queen Elizabeth I and Dr. John Dee and the Enochian system of magic, but you highlight beautifully this Twelver Shi Hadith tradition about Idris or Enoch being identified as the, quote, primal astrologer or, quote, the father of astrology. And reading this blew me away because I had never heard this association before. Can you share about Idris and about this Hadith?
Sure. Well, astrology in general, by a number of classical Muslim authors, is associated with the ancient prophets. So like Abraham, or in this case, Idris/Enoch. And you don't only find this in Shi'i writings, but when it comes to the Hadith corpus, the strongest link that's presented is that Idris brought, or Enoch brought astrology to Earth. Oftentimes, Idris is a prophet that's mentioned in the Quran. There's not much mentioned about him, as is often the case. So maybe it's that people already knew who he was, so you didn't have to say anything. But in any case, there tends to be a belief that he went to the heavens. So, and again, there's a number of reasons for that are mentioned. But within the Shi'i Hadith corpus, I would say the dominant one is that he wanted to meet the angel of death because he said that, like, sort of like having death hanging over me is bothering me and I want to be at peace. So I'd like to get to know the angel of death first. So he goes up to the heavens. And then there's a couple different accounts. Either he meets the angel of death and then he comes back and, he sees stuff in the heavens too. Or else he just stays. And the angel of death comes to him and says, I got this message saying I'm supposed to take Idris's soul and he's in the fourth heaven. And how is Idris going to be in the fourth heaven when he's still alive? But here you are. Anyway, but the point is there's this idea that he went to the heavens. And of course, to bring back astrology, he would have had to come back. And this idea that astrology is of divine origin and was brought down is used in another narration, which I cite, another hadith, which I cite, which is a debate between Imam Sadiq and a man from India. I can't remember offhand if he's an astrologer or not, but he's supposed to know about astrology because he's from India. He might have just been more like a philosopher. But in any case, Imam Sadiq argues that because we don't see all the configurations of the planets in our lifetime, especially like the big conjunctions and stuff. It might be like once every few hundred years or, maybe thousands of years for some configurations. So no human being could figure out astrology in their natural lifetime just through observing. Therefore, the only way we can we can have this knowledge of interpreting the planets and the stars is if it was revealed knowledge from God, because God understands things. And also astrology is very complicated, so it obviously has to come from God. So there's this idea that it is of divine origin. So, again, this is perhaps different from the perception today that it's somehow evil or Satan came out with astrology or whatever. So Idris is one of the people who's mentioned as being the first astrologer and the first in other things too. He's said to have been the first person to have sewn clothing, the first person to use a pen. Geomancy or Ramal is attributed to him. I have to give him a special thanks. I had an emergency geomancy moment this morning. Unfortunately, I have a problem with losing things, and I lost my wallet.
Ooh. Oh, no.
Yeah. Where is it? Probably the trash can. So I'm thinking, well, maybe someone stole it and just binned it because they didn't want to get in trouble using their credit card or whatever.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was my emergency moment, and thanks to Nabi Idris for helping with that. But that's also attributed to him. He's said to have lived fairly early in human histories. Now, I'm going to be honest, I'm not as well versed in the biblical tradition of Enoch, so I'm not the person who's put these two names together, but everyone says it's the same person, so I'm just going to go with that.
No, this is wonderful context because I think again it just shows how there are so many similarities depending on the tradition and the culture and the esoteric tradition. And your hadith, the corpus of hadiths that you select and the presentation, it was just blowing my mind because for me it was connecting so many dots. In fact, to your point, Dr. Inloes, can you share with us? There's a phrase that I had never heard before, but I love it: astrological remediation. Can you talk about that? And because in your article, you highlight how some of the hadith show, quote, how ill astrological omens came to be remediated in the Twelver Shi corpus. So what is this whole concept of astrological remediation?
Sure. So the idea behind that is if you have a challenging placement in your birth chart, or it's just a bad time to do something, or there's something portending poorly in an astrological sense, that you can do things to offset the difficulty or calamity. So this might be a case where people had a sort of crisis point in their chart. In the tradition, they called it a cut, but the idea is it might cut off your life. So are you approaching one of these difficult transits? And so I want to point out, first of all, I don't think the average Shi'i would have any idea what astrological remediation is. This is a sort of thing that you don't know what it is unless you know what astrology is. And then you're like, oh, that's what's going on there. Even though it is discussed in the context of astrology and the condition in the article, whatever. Okay, so one of the things I, again, didn't mention in the article, the Shi'i Hadith corpus also has a very well-developed section on the virtues of different gemstones. And Muslims in general will appreciate certain gemstones. And, again, Sufis will be a bit more enthusiastic. And I would say, without making comparisons, there's a lot of material on gemstones and different ones like turquoise, aqiq, which is, I guess, kind of like, it's oftentimes been said to be carnelian, but I think it's not. Maybe anyway, you go to a Muslim who works with gemstones, tell them you want aqiq, and you'll see what it is. It's a red stone. There's something called Dora Najaf, which is something you only find in Najaf in Iraq, which is where Imam Ali is buried. It's a clear stone. I think it might be a type of quartz. Rubies, emeralds. So the point is there's a lot of stones that have merits. I personally suspect this relates to the custom of wearing gemstones to remediate your birth chart in India. And I think that this custom reached probably Iraq, around there, I'm going to guess. And sort of the associations with the signs survive. So, for example, rubies and glory and fame and emeralds and love or whatever. But the idea that this is personalized doesn't get into the tradition. So that gets lost. So this idea anyone can wear a stone and it will have these effects, which, I suppose that could be some truth to that. I would sort of qualify that by saying that if you're talking to a spiritual practitioner, the Ruhaniyyah tradition, who happens to be Shi'i, they will typically select a stone for you personally based on your own criteria and not just be like, everyone has to wear turquoise for protection. Another common one, it's, I don't know what it is in English. It's called Hadith Sini. It's a sort of shiny, dark gray / it's not exactly black. It's a very dark gray. And it's said to be a very powerful protective stone. So you usually get like religious engravings on it. And again, I'm not necessarily getting into the talismanic tradition. These are just things people will do who aren't necessarily spiritual practitioners, but because they say these stones have merits and so forth. So the point is, I think that is an aspect of astrological remediation that probably came from India and just sort of morphed and got absorbed. And to be honest, it didn't quite keep everything that it had, but that happens. Another thing that's mentioned is giving charity. And this is actually, along the same lines. I think it's along the same lines, and maybe one of the viewers can, or you, can let me know. But to my knowledge, there's the idea in Vedic astrology that you can give charity to offset a planet's influence, like planetary charity. So maybe like, Jupiter, you give your money to monks or something, Saturn, farmers, to sort of placate that planet, if you will. Whereas in the Shi tradition, it's just that if you are facing a difficult astrological event, you can give charity in general. It doesn't specify planetary. So I'm giving a caveat because I don't know what era the concept of planetary charity developed in India or elsewhere. That's just my guess, but someone might be able to fill in the details there. So that's one way to look at it. On the other hand, you could also look at it just from a religious perspective, which is what many people will do. They won't think about planetary charity, and they'll just say, well, it's a way of approaching the divine. So you give charity, and Allah changes things for the better for you because Allah's power is above the planets. I think both interpretations are valid, but those are a couple ways in which it appears that remediation is handled in the corpus.
That's lovely. Thank you, Dr. Inloes, because that really blew my mind reading that and how it weaves into even the Hadith corpus and magic and astrology, weaving into, to your point, the points about jurisprudence. So, for example, one of the things, and I'd love for you to share with the listeners about this, you mentioned in your paper, why is the moon in Scorpio so important in Shi'i jurisprudence? Because that was an interesting moon in Scorpio. Yeah.
That is something that has made its way into formal Shi'i Islamic law. And that is basically when the moon is in Scorpio, there are certain things you shouldn't do just because it's not auspicious, for lack of a better word. It's an unfavorable time. And it's not that you're not allowed to do them, but you're just advised not to do them. And I would say in real life, there are some Shi'is who observe this, like if they're going to get married, they won't do it when the moon is in Scorpio. Conception is on the list. I know you don't always pick conception times, but that there have been people who have tried to conceive at astrologically auspicious times, setting out on journeys or whatever. There are things that people will sometimes avoid, and then there's people who just think this is like old-fashioned and don't pay any attention to it. But it is there in the books anyway, and that's from an astrological perspective, the moon is in fall in Scorpio, and there's a lot of in general, it's not advised to do benefic spiritual workings when the moon is in Scorpio, unless it's like some kind of emergency situation. So it is considered, certainly from the spiritual / occult tradition, to be a challenging time. But in terms of formalized Shi'i Islamic law, it is something that is also mentioned. And as for why it's mentioned, simply is because it's in the prominent Hadith books, so you can't really ignore it.
Excellent. That's lovely. Thank you, Dr. Inloes. And you were touching a few moments ago, of course, on the next half of the podcast, where I'm so excited to chat with you about the Occult Curios and the 5 selections that you have to go through. But just as we wrap up the Twelver astrology with the Shi'i Hadith corpus, can you just share with the listeners what are some of the biggest misconceptions that you're hoping your latest research shatters? I mean, just for me, one of them coming away from reading your work is how complex it is, how nuanced, how heterodox in many ways. Like there are different ways that you can look at it. I mean, what are some of the other big things for the listeners out there that you want them to keep in mind when they think about Shi'i, Twelver, the Hadith corpus, or astrology? Anything in particular?
That Islam isn't a monolith. There is a fair amount of diversity within the tradition, and that sometimes gets a bit lost today. Because there is a certain strand of thought, if you will, that's very dour and very hostile and not very spiritual, that sometimes gets a lot of bandwidth and a lot of airtime. By that, I'm referring to the Salafi and Wahhabi movements. I'm not really afraid we have many viewers with those inclinations. And why they get that airtime, in parts because they've got a lot of funding, especially in the past. Saudi Arabia funded this kind of material, or they'd send the imams to mosques who have these ideologies. They'd fund the publication of books. So that's really become much louder than other voices. But I think there's also a slightly deeper reason, and it goes back to what I was saying before, and that is Salafism and Wahhabism are rooted in the idea that should get rid of things they consider superstitious or backwards or whatever. And again, up until maybe 10 years ago, or even that, astrology was largely a taboo subject in the West, and because the West influences the rest of the world. So basically, in the polite society, if you will, you couldn't talk about astrology. I'm sure you might remember that professor who got fired, I think it was in Canada, for astrologizing. It was a few years ago. But the point is, this isn't even an Islamic issue. It's just a secular issue. And I would say, even with respect to this article, it took a while to find it a home. And that's because I submitted it to some places in the US. And it does seem that, and I'm not talking about Muslims, but it does seem that there's people in the US who do consider astrology to be a sensitive subject, especially in a university context. There's a lot of reasons why there's certain voices that are very loud nowadays. But the past was a lot different, not just in the Shi'i tradition. But also that there is this sense that's been spread among Muslims that, it's basically haram. It's forbidden to do anything that's somehow supernatural. Of course, prayer is supernatural. So, you can never really find where that dividing line is. But of course, as I'm sure you've discussed with Liana Saif as well, things like writing talismans and so forth were fairly common in the past, and well-known scholars like Al-Ghazali, for example, he's got his number square for facilitating birth and so forth. So doesn't seem there was quite as much sensitivity, and these things were part of the heritage, not just in a dodgy way, like, there was a guy who used to drop off flyers at the local laundromat that said, "The professor is in." And he was that kind of professor, and he must have gotten clients or he wouldn't be dropping off flyers. But, it wasn't just like the sort of shadowy guy on the street, but it was people in the highest echelons of society were also participating in this work. And it's kind of ironic because this was well known up until, I'd say, probably the 1900s. And this might also be another reason why there's been this sort of backlash. You read stuff, say, 1900s, 1910, 1920s, by Europeans about Muslims, and they'll oftentimes criticize Muslims for being unchristian, in the sense that those Muslims, they're so pagan, they've got these talismans and these rituals. So they're actually associating magic with Muslims. And that might be one of the reasons a lot of Muslims sort of pushed back on that, because really the impact of European colonialism culturally on the Muslim majority world can't be underestimated. To sort of say, no, we Muslims are actually quite rational, and that's just what they do in the village. And, so this stuff was sort of pushed away from the learned society. So it's nice to be able to go back and find a variety of things in our sources and have more nuanced discussions about them.
Well, that's why, Dr. Inloes, we're so honored that you are sharing your voice and really amplifying the power of the historical complexity and nuance in Islamic esotericism and in the, of course, the Twelver Shi tradition. And that's what I love. I love about your research. Dr. Liana Saif, as you say, both of you blow my mind because it's cross-pollination of academic and scholarly ideas that really help me connect the dots and push into that, that deep Saturnine earth, if you will, of this rich tradition in Islamic esotericism. And okay, this leads actually, Dr. Inloes, you set it up perfectly. So you're pushing back on, as you say, these other currents of, Islamic practice and thought. And you talk about how, even in recent decades or in decades past, things have become, people are trying to, really clamp down or cut off or categorize Islam. And this goes to the second excellent area of research that you're pushing back and illuminating for readers, which is occult curios in the Twelver Shi Hadith tradition. And I think the best place to start is this. So in your latest research, which we'll get into, Dr. Inloes, you present 5 Hadith in the pre-modern Twelver Shi corpus that cover topics like written amulets, prophetic medicine, exorcism, sigils, commanding angels and jinn, Hellenic astrology, and necromancy. So this whole menagerie of topics. But the way that you introduce these 5 selections, I really loved and appreciated, because your research aims to push back against a, quote, as you say, a popular contemporary notion that the entirety of extant hadith corpuses, Sunni, Shi'i, or otherwise, wholly prohibit the employment of the supernatural. So why did this popular notion arise, this popular contemporary notion? Where did this come from?
The Salafi and Wahhabi ideologies definitely have a strong to play. And to be honest, in some circles, there's a bit of a financial motivation too. Certainly even here, and I'm in London in the United Kingdom as I speak, which has a large Muslim population. The number of people who actually offer traditional spiritual services, by that I mean basically exorcism and cupping especially, has multiplied tremendously over the years. And many of these people are hardcore Salafis, so they're going to be, looking for deviants and deviant ideologies and so forth. But because these things are endorsed within the Sunni and Shi'i Hadith traditions, they're considered acceptable. But there is a lot of money in that business. I'm just going to put it out there. And there's, sometimes people who are doing things for business, they do social media to promote their business and promote their ideas. And some people might actually say something from their heart because they think it's true. So I'm not saying everyone's like, out to make a buck or whatever, a pound. But nonetheless, that there's a certain impetus to promote what they're doing, that they're doing the right thing. The way I've come to see it with respect to Wahhabism and Salafism, is that throughout most of Islamic history, and especially when you get to Sufism or Shiism, usually the miracles come through individuals. So it might be the Prophet Muhammad brings a miracle, or the Imam or a Sufi saint. Shi'is tend to assume that the ulamas or the religious scholars who are very learned, a lot of times assume they can do some miraculous things, or, translocate, bilocate, whatever it happens to be. But there's a personal element. But it seems like in my opinion, with Salafi and Wahhabi, it's more of an ideological element. So it's not that the charisma of the holy person will save you, for example, will kick out the evil jinn or whatever. But rather it's adhering to the correct ideology and deviancies is what will save you. So it's a way they've sort of replaced the human who links you with Allah with the ideology that links you with Allah. That's my sense of the dynamic behind it. I know exceptions can apply, but in any case, I'm saying there's a lot going on. And so this sort of way of thinking begins to build up speed. And I think also a lot of Muslim youth, especially in the West, do tend to go more towards the drier ideologies, if you will, that are a little bit more exoteric and material, just because they probably seem to fit better in the West. It's not that uncommon that, let's say you have a Muslim family living in the West and the grandparents are Sufis, and, maybe the mom and dad's just like busy with work and they don't care. And then the kids come out more like, the more stricter, but not necessarily spiritual oriented ideologies, which is rejecting, some Sufism and the spiritual traditions of the past. That does tend to happen. And I think it's just sort of the pressure of going to school in the West and being a Muslim and being different and so forth. Of course, that doesn't explain things globally, but globally it's a complicated situation too. I saw a study once and I've looked for it so many times. It's like, wow, someone actually has statistics and I can cite them. But it was about Muslims believing in jinn. So, they've got different percentages in different countries, and much lower, like in former Soviet republics and so forth. And then the author mentions that quite frequently, as soon as Muslims feel like something's going wrong, no matter how atheist they may profess to be or secular, they start believing in jinn, which I think is actually true for a lot of countries. I mean, people might say they don't believe this, and then they call you up the next day. Am I cursed? Like, okay, you were telling me yesterday there's no curses. What's happened here? So outside the West and the former USSR, most places I think do have a much more of a place of the supernatural in daily life. But this in general is some thoughts on that.
I love that because it again shows how, as you said, there are so many things from the past, and paying attention to history and how it interacts, I think is so key. So thank you for that, Dr. Inloes. And to that very point, to show about the heterodoxy, the complexity, how things aren't as cut and dry, you share and analyze 5 hadiths in the Shi'i corpus, the pre-modern Twelver Shi'i corpus. And curiosity number 1 that you present, which I'd love to get into to that point, so many listeners are familiar with, in the Western esoteric tradition, this super celestial angel or being, Metatron. Can you share about curiosity number 1, which is about Metatron, and how the angel, as you say, quote, is only one of the curiosities in this all-purpose hadith, providing instructions for a written amulet attributed to Ali. So, end quote. So can you tell us what is the relationship with Metatron and this amulet? What's going on here?
To be honest, Metatron seems to come out of nowhere. If you think about it, there isn't really any explanation given for Metatron in the Islamic tradition because he's not really a part of the Islamic tradition, apart from the occult books, which might suggest they're drawing on earlier materials. But he does appear in a couple Shi'i hadith, and I did make a note that there is a Metatron that a Sunni author mentions in Quranic hadith, Quranic exegesis. So it seems to be the same being. But in any case, this is an amulet, as you mentioned, attributed to Imam Ali. So this would be in the context of the traditional or prophetic medicine. Yes, it's prescribed for someone who's suffering from curse work. They're afflicted with jinn. They have epilepsy. They've been poisoned. They need protection from ruler, from Satan, or anything else a human may fear. Also including beasts, snakes, scorpions, or anything else that might vex the human being. So it's a wide range of applications is prescribed. There are a number of texts of this nature within the Shi'i books. This isn't the only one. Metatron, however, does not come up very often. So you start with in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Then you have some names. And that was kind of why I suggested this too. Like, the instinct you get when you are familiar with occult works is that this follows along the same patterns in invocation of occult works. It's not just like the names or Metatron or whatever, but there's something about the way that it's written. It's similar in a way that's a bit difficult to explain. But in any case, there are unknown names, at least unknown to us, which are mentioned. And then we call on Metatron, and then we continue with the unknown names, some ayahs of the Holy Quran, Shari'ah, some divine names. And then the actual charge, if you will, to protect or to repel mischievous beings from the wearer of this amulet. So that's what's going on there. And overall, I found that interesting. It's the sort of thing that you might expect to find a bit more of in say, Shams al-Ma'arif than a hadith book. But there are occasional crossovers.
it's so cool because you're right. Like just breaking out of those thought patterns of, oh, Metatron, found in, European Western grimoires, or like, 17th century angel magicians in Britain. And then here you have this wonderful Metatronic current that, as you say, kind of pops out of nowhere. And one of the things that I love, Dr. Inloes, that you highlight as well is this aspect of angelology, if you will, in the Islamic Hadith corpus. And to that very point, the second Hadith you share instructs the operator, and this blew my mind, to command the jinn, acting on the behalf of someone else by, quote, instructing the supplicant to assert their authority through the seals of the archangels Jibril, Mikael, and Israfil, possibly concording, as you say, with the apocryphal angel Seraphiel, as well as the seals of Solomon and the prophet, end quote. This was so fascinating. What is this all about? What's going on here?
It's all about covering all bases here. We're not leaving any possibilities out. You got the angels and Suleiman and the prophet. This is another text. I mean, the existence of this text, I think for the average reader would not be familiar with occult texts. They probably wouldn't really pay much attention to it. Shiism is distinct from quote unquote mainstream Sunnism. I don't always like that word, but we know what it means. And that there are a lot of prayers for specific days, specific times, specific circumstances that are lengthy. So certainly if you want to recite all your Monday prayers, like all the ones that have actually been penned down, you're going to be there for a while. I mean, there's some of them that people do more than others. This one is definitely more obscure, but it does exist in the books. So this is something that you recite on Mondays for protection. In particular, for protecting someone else who, as I observe in the article, maybe it's because they're incapacitated, they're in a coma or something. So that's why you have to seek their protection, or they're absent or whatever. But from the perspective of someone who's reading occult texts, there's a lot of things that jump out at you. One of them being that we're seeking protection for this person, son of this person's mother. That's very unusual in the Islamic tradition outside of occult works. In the occult works, you identify someone by so-and-so son or daughter of their mother, which I think we also do in the PGM as well. And it's also said that in the hereafter, called by our mother's name and not by the father's name. Sorry, no prejudice intended. This was said. But in any case, that's a very unusual thing. So that caught my attention when I saw this. And then seeking protection through God. Yes, and then we get to the jinns. I call you all, O jinn. Should you be hearing and obeying? I call you all, O humankind. So we're addressing jinns and humans here, basically to Allah. Al-Latif al-Khabir, the subtle, the aware. I call you all, humans and jinn, to the one whom all of creation yields to. So you're calling on divine authority to command them, which is also very typical in the occult texts. And then we get to the seals. I don't have the text with me right now. I could tell you where to find it. It's in Tafsir al-Asfa, which is it's a Shi'i tafsir, which is very heavily Hadith based, which a colleague and former classmate of mine translated, and it's published in English, a very beautiful edition. This is only one of the few examples I've seen, at least in the Islamic tradition, where there's actually a protection putting the angels in specific directions, which is something you'll find in Western occultism quite common, but not very often, at least not in the Islamic occult texts. There are beings associated with directions, but to actually sort of physically protect yourself in that way. And it's not an occult text. It's just a hadith giving this is where we blur the lines. It's a more normative sounding hadith with a protective prayer. But in any case, we've got the seals of the angels, yes, and Suleiman, Solomon, and the prophet. And then we declare, I have removed from this person, the son of this person's mother, any jinn with a rebellious jinn spirit. and some other types of spirits. I have removed from them what can be seen and what cannot be seen. So we get the idea here that we're not only praying in a passive sense, but the operator, if you will, they are asserting that I am the one who has removed from this person, not, please remove from this person. So it is a different tone than you find in the direct petitionary prayer. And again, this is all fairly old material. I think the sources I cite are around the 10th century. So, it's from a long time ago, but it's got a different sort of flavor than what people might necessarily expect.
Oh, it blew my mind, and you trace out with this specific area the relationship between, in the above hadith, you mentioned the adoration that's used, Qudus, Rabb al-Malakati wa Ruh, which you say resembles a similar exhortation used in other Shi'i prayers. So there's that connection again. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, usually the one you hear a bit more often is Subuhum Qudusun Rabbul Malaikati wa Ruh. So exalted and holy be the Lord of the angels and the spirit. I was told last month that there's a Hebrew equivalent to this. I forgot it.
Oh, that's fascinating. Well, and I certainly know in the Hebrew Bible as well, like with, Kadosh, the seraphim, the angels are around the throne, Kadosh, 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 that immediately made me think of that too. Yeah.
Yeah. But so in any case, this phrase does appear in a lot of the Islamic occult texts as well. And now we've got it here.
Again, the context, the cross-pollination, you did this so well. And again, listeners, check out the links below to pick up your own copy, by the way, of Dr. Inloes' Shams al-Ma'arif from 2021, Revelor Press, but also in this latest research, Dr. Inloes, you are absolutely blowing my mind on this. And you even yes, I mean, really, because the contexts are so great, and the dots that you connect in my under-caffeinated brain, even me, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is blowing my mind. So here, you also touch on topics that are, even in, kind of the European Western esoteric tradition, were among the most forbidden in some areas, which would be this necromancy. Can you share with us, because this is one of the kind of topics that you touch on in your research, what is the stance on necromancy, or the raising of the dead or engaging with dead spirits in the Twelver Shi Hadith tradition? Was this permitted? Was it the expectation for the Prophet and the Imams to converse with shades of the dead, or are these actually physically manifested spirits of the dead? What is necromancy all about?
Yeah, well, of course, I'm not sure there's a cognate word to necromancy in the tradition. I used that to call attention that it involves raising up a deceased person to physical appearance, which is, I'm going to say this is an outlier in the tradition. It's fairly normative for people in the tradition to talk about having visions of the deceased, like a waking vision or a dream of the deceased. The potential for people to talk with the deceased, like you and me, it's, I mean, Shiism, like any other religious tradition, is not a monolith. Some Shi'is do tend to be more focused on practical matters of daily life, like inheritance law or whatever, dietary law. And then some people are more into like the mystical philosophy and these sorts of things. And sometimes that leaning, a person's leaning, will affect what they think is possible. I was talking to someone the other day. Sure, I should identify him or not. I doubt he's listening. Okay, I was talking to my boss at work. Who's a very, I would describe him as a very, by the book, Shi'i scholar. Like, his hobby is translating Islamic law, and he just does it, and he loves it. So we're talking about talking to dead people, and he said something. So I said to him, did you just say that if you can, like, meditate enough, then you can go into the imaginal realm and talk with deceased people? And he's like, yeah. Like, it totally worked for him. And I'm like, well, personally, I'm fine with that. I have no problem with that. I just wasn't expecting him to tell me that, But But setting aside that example, and if he's listening by any chance, of course, I'll say hi. But the point is, I don't think a lot of learned people would have theological issues with the possibility of communicating with the dead in some manner, like he was saying, like a deep meditation or visionary state, or these kinds of things, and not like continually, but maybe on and off and that sort of thing. As for like conversing whenever you will, usually that's reserved for the prophets and the imams. But this, of course, is this is a bit of a weirder situation because basically there's a disagreement between Imam Ali and the first caliph. So Imam Ali goes and he raises the Prophet Muhammad, who's deceased. So, and then the first caliph goes and finds him in the mosque, and he has the normal reaction that one has in such a circumstance. And then, of course, the Prophet sides with Imam Ali because this is a Shi'i Hadith text. And then the first caliph leaves and he's talking to someone, and the other person says, well, don't you know this is the Sihr of the Bani Hashim, Imam Ali's tribe. So he's saying Imam Ali did a bit of sihr to bring back the Prophet to life and speak to him. So, I mean, the thrust of the Hadith is to demonstrate the merits of Imam Ali, that, look, he can raise the Prophet from the dead. But it's also, I would say this is definitely weirder than some of the other miracles ascribed to the Prophet and the Imams, like miraculous food or something. This doesn't come up too often.
Again, this goes to that amazing context. Thank you for sharing that. And to that very point, Dr. Inloes, one of the big themes in your research and even here in this chat is you contextualizing and talking about how this is not black or white. There's a lot of complexity. And I think one of the later points that you make in this very article is this. You mentioned that, quote, during the pre-Islamic era, during the era of Jahiliyyah, when Islam itself was at risk, sorcerers and jinn were perceived solely as threats. However, you say post-prophetic Shi'i Hadith firmly place jinn, sorcerers, and sorcery under the control of the Imam, whose very existence holds the cosmos intact, end quote. So could you share with us about the deep lessons that people can learn about this specific placing of jinn, sorcerers, and sorcery under the control of the Imam?
This is one of the reasons why I think there is more acceptance of certain things in the Shi'i Hadith corpus. Now, obviously, prior to Islam, not every jinn or every sorcerer is going to be a threat. If they're on your side, it's a great thing. The poets used to say they got inspiration from jinn, and they probably did, and so forth. But at least from the perspective of the budding Muslim civilization, there was just more of a sense that these are things that might be working against them. Like there's a common story that a woman tried to do magic against the Prophet Muhammad, for example. With respect to jinn, it's actually a bit more of a complicated thing. But when you look at least the material that has been retained talking about the Prophet Muhammad's time and area, and again, we don't necessarily know how accurate everything it is, but usually in the early material, jinn are treated as more as threats, like they might cause an illness or mischief or something like that. But throughout the Shi'i Hadith, which again are collected over a longer period of time, after a while the jinn start to become a lot nicer, especially with respect to the martyrdom of Imam Hussein. They come to the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad and the cities around there, and they tell the people what's happened. The jinn are composing poetry in lamentation of Imam Hussein. It said that the jinn came to Imam Hussein and they wanted to help him. So there's a sort of sympathy, if you will, for the Prophet's grandson and his lineage. And after a while, you start to get hadith where the jinn come to the imams to learn, and then sometimes the imams ask the jinn to do something. And there's one of the hadith where one of the imams tells off some of his followers, is like, look at you, these jinn are much better followers than you are. So, they're not so much scary outside entities anymore. And I think in part, this might have to do with the fact that there was a fair degree of stability in Islamic civilization for a few hundred years after the advent of Islam. I mean, like many other religious movements, at the very beginning, Islam was a threatened movement, a lot of persecution, and most people wouldn't have thought it would have persisted. But, once it spread and then was integrated into what became the Arab Muslim Empire, so there's the ruling classes are also identifying as Muslims, you don't necessarily have the same fear for your identity anymore. And so I think, a lot of stories about the supernatural, fairy tales, folklore, whatever it is, a lot of times the supernatural is used to talk about things that might not necessarily be supernatural, but things that are threatening, things that are fears, things that are deep in our psyche. Basically I'm saying it's not always about the jinn. Sometimes it's about what's going on in the world around us. Same thing in horror movies and so forth. And so it seems like once civilization reached a certain point of stability, or the new civilization, then jinn don't seem to have been as scary anymore. And certainly in Shiism, as you mentioned, there is the, very strong belief, although Shi'is vary, but it is traditional to have a belief that the Prophet and Imam have a sort of spiritual authority over everything, whether or not they choose to do it. Like, the Imam could levitate my laptop if he wants. Probably he doesn't want to, but they have this cosmic authority, if you will. And so, in a sense, no one can out magic them, or they're not going to be harmed by jinns and so forth. So that might also be a reason why there is less of a sense of fear. So for what we learned from that, I guess it is just considering how things like maybe the sense of a threat to our identity, whether it's individual or communal, or other situations and forces around us in society might be reflected in how we discuss the unseen and the supernatural, and whether we perceive it as something that is scary. Like we were talking about colonialism a bit before and how that's impacted some Muslims' views of things like astrology, and how having maybe a certain degree of peace and stability in society might necessarily make some of the things that go bump in the night seem less scary.
Again, this is I forget the word in Arabic for context. I think it's siyaq, but this is the contextualization that you are so great. I'm always blown away to hear about. Again, your work is challenging me, Dr. Inloes, and I'm sure it is to the listeners, to think about things differently, to really look at the heterodox, the complexities, the nuances. And I think you do that just so well. And to that very point, Dr. Inloes, we have, well, let's see, I know we have 3 listener questions for you, and we have a very brief after show. But before we get to that last section, when it comes to the Occult Curios, and when it comes to your lovely, again, second paper that you're discussing today, what are some of the big takeaways that you want listeners to know, in addition to the nuance and the heterodoxy and the complexity? Are there any other misconceptions that people might have that you feel, by illuminating the Twelver Shi Hadith corpus, it can help break those misconceptions, or anything else that you'd like to share with listeners about the Occult Curios section?
It's interesting to see how all of these things slot into a shared narrative, both in the past and in the present. One of the ways I've tried to sell these ideas is by pointing out to people that even if you don't have any particular interest in Shiism, if you are studying this time period, say the Abbasid Empire in the Arab Muslim world, this is a fairly rigorously curated historical source. I mean, the thing that separates a Hadith book from just an ordinary book of history is that even if there are still questions about authenticity, there's a lot of rigor that goes into trying to include the most accurate material. So who's relating it? Where did they get it from? The Hadith sciences, which Shi'is also practice, both Sunnis and Shi'is practice them enthusiastically. And so these texts also reflect just things that were going on in society. And so they can be an interesting counterpoint to, or an interesting supplement to, other works which might be looking at the role of astrology or occult practices during the classical era. One of the fun things I did in one of the Hadith in the astrology paper is because it actually included someone's outline of electional astrological timing for a political event. I actually got out some astrology software and I found that configuration of the planets. And then I compared it against the dates we have for that event in other historical sources, and they matched, which was very nice. But it's an interesting way to try to validate historical sources. Because I just can't imagine someone who's fabricating history is actually going to be figuring out where the planets were at the time. So these are all nuances that you can do if you know something about astrology and you're looking at the sources. That was a text which was interesting too, speaking of shared narratives, because it does mention Buran, who was one of the first female astrologers to be mentioned. It mentions her marriage, just in brief. It's not like about the marriage. It's like, and Buran was married to so-and-so. And then it continues on. But that's something that's become quite prominent in today's narrative that people are looking at, both in the astrological community and also in general trying to reconstruct the history of women in the sciences, which astrology would have been put under that category. She had to get out her astrolabe to do astrology. She wasn't just using her iPhone to get predictions or something. So she would have had to have been a solid astronomer too. In the past, it's not like it wasn't known that she did astrology, but she was known primarily for having a really big wedding. Like that was why she's remembered. Oh, and by the way, she did astrology. But today, now that there's more effort to try to identify women by name who made contributions or participated in the sciences, now that aspect of her is looked at a bit more. So that's something that's, it intersects with both what people might have been talking about in the past or historically, but also topics of interest today. So I enjoyed that little exercise trying to calculate that out. But I guess ultimately what people take from texts is individual, whatever is meaningful to them. Someone who has a different background might read these things and take entirely different things from them, and that's okay.
And again, that is what I love. And you've done this right now. You've done this, of course, with your wonderful translation and contextualization of the first 8 chapters of the Shams al-Ma'arif, but it's that contextualization. It's really saying, here's the tradition that this comes out of. And that is so rejuvenating, very refreshing for me. And I know for the listeners as well, Dr. Inloes. And to that point, I know we have a very brief after show, and I do want to chat for the main podcast about any hints on your upcoming projects. But before we get there, we have 3 quick listener questions for you. The first is a listener question from Glitch Bottle patron Twice and Thrice, which I love the name, is from a Sufi perspective, how can a person sever and stop attacks from jinn and from ifrits from an occult perspective, end quote. And I know this is about the Sufi perspective, but really, Dr. Inloes, any kind of advice or information would be great.
Well, different Sufi orders have their own protocols. So it's not really a general answer question, but if there is an order you adhere to, you should consult a sheikh or someone in the order with knowledge of these things for advice on what to do in that lineage. I do think that to some degree, even just initiating into an order may be a helpful step because you're bringing, especially if there's some sincerity involved, maybe even if not, you're linking yourself into the whole line, and that can sometimes shift things. Not that I'm advising you to make rash decisions. From a broader perspective, first of all, I would be sure that jinn are actually the problem. I know whoever this is probably is sick of hearing this, but I'm just pointing that out because there are physical conditions that can certainly make you feel like you're being attacked by spirits, especially any kind of neurological reaction or condition. You do feel like you're possessed, but you're not. And some people get that to, frankly, I know people have gotten it from artificial sweeteners or vitamin deficiencies, or some sort of condition. But my point is, attack can be so many different things. You could be dealing with like a direct psychic energetic attack trying to ore into your skull, or do you have spirits hitting you? Are you seeing things? Are you having accidents? Attack is a very broad spectrum. So I'm saying, first of all, just be sure that's the issue. And then beyond that, my advice is not going to be very exciting. I'm going to give you the general advice. Many Muslims go for ruqyah, the religious exorcism, try to find someone decent. Doesn't hurt. You can do it yourself. It does work. That's why people do it. It is generally, a lot of people aren't attacked by spirits just because on a regular basis. So, is there anything, and it might not be you, it might be someone else. I'm not necessarily giving this advice to you, but broadly speaking, is there anything you might have that might be a problem object? I mean, when you keep objects around that have spirits bound to them, and you may not know that it has a spirit bound to them. I mean, someone might have done it to you maliciously, but sometimes people collect these things on purpose, that they can sometimes be temperamental and challenging, so it helps to clear out anything that might be challenging. Groups, are you working with any magical groups that might be doing things to their members? That does happen, including online groups. Even if it's just a Facebook group, they might. I don't want to cast aspersions, but I can think of one example of a group where the admin was doing things to the members. So I'm saying is there anything you can change that might take you off the radar? And of course, if you're, engaging in magical practices, I mean, like if you're going to the cemetery and doing cemetery magic and then things are bothering you at home, that might be the problem. And none of that may apply, but that is a good thing to look at. Beyond that, again, the general advice, prayer. I mean, I know it sounds really basic, but aligning yourself with God and the higher forces drives away lower forces. And I don't really think, although I'm a practicing Muslim, I don't think it terribly matters how you do it. Like, are you just going to contemplate on the beauty of the universe or the names of Allah or recite the Quran or some other sacred book? But just to align yourself with the higher powers and petition for assistance. Protective talismans are fairly common. And again, I don't think it particularly matters what tradition you get a protective talisman from. As long as it's protecting you, that's what you want. And these things work, and that's why people use them. Let's see here. Protective talismans, prayers, exorcisms. I mean, very basic Muslim advice. I mean, I kind of skip the basics because, I assume you already know them. But many Muslims will recite the 4 quls before going to sleep. The surahs, starting with qul. Some people say reciting Surah al-Jinn also is helpful for that. Maybe it reminds the jinns of good behavior. Just trying to keep a spiritually clean space. So by that, I mean space clearing and an occult perspective, if you will. Some incenses can be helpful too in driving away things. Camphor, you could try that. Esfand, or what do you call it? Syrian rue, harmel is very commonly used for this purpose. It's customary in some countries that people burn it every week after cleaning, just to make sure their house is spick and span of those shayateen as well. And there's a reason why it does tend to drive things away. I mean, also, there's just so much that could be going on. It could just be an issue with where you live. I mean, even where I live is a bit challenging. There's a cemetery nearby, which is not in the best spiritual shape. So, if you're dealing with challenging things where you live, I mean, you just kind of have to try to make peace with it, or get them out, or leave. I mean, those are basically your options, and sometimes you have to be a bit creative. It took me a while to sort of sort out where I'm living right now. So my point is, it might be a personal thing, it might be a land thing, it could be any kind of thing, but those are just the the common things that would be recommended. Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, this is great, Dr. Inloes. Thank you. I think you're really hitting on the practicality of everything. Just finding a new way. Everyone lives in a different place, different area. Finding those practical ways is wonderful. So thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And actually mentioning Al-Quran al-Hakim, the holy and wise Quran. This next listener question touches on using the Quran and the applications of the Quran. And again, it's something where chatting with you, I know it's something with the Shams al-Ma'arif that you've touched on, the relationship with the Quran. When I've spoken with Dr. Dunya Rashid talking about Akbarianism and Ibn Arabi, Dr. Liana Saif, the Quran obviously is a huge theme. And so this question is from Glitch Bottle patron Alfonso Parutz, who is asking you, Dr. Inloes, can you expand on the occult applications of the Holy Quran, if possible, in an esoteric view? So and I know you've touched on this in our previous conversation as well, but anything that we haven't touched on about the Holy Quran and its application esoterically?
I agree that Shams al-Ma'arif is a good source to go through because a large portion of it is basically about that, as well as the occult application of the divine names. I'm not entirely sure what the question is about. Like, are we just talking about things for practical purposes, like healing, protection, destroying one's enemy, or are we talking about like more esoteric things like astral projecting and visions? Or I'm not sure where the question is.
Actually, that's a great point. And Alfonso, you can correct me on the Glitch Bottle Patreon if I'm totally not characterizing this, but the way I read it, Dr. Inloes, is it's about how can one use, ayah or ayat verses from the Quran in an esoteric application. So, for example, you just brought up maybe reciting the surahs that begin with Qul. Perhaps that's an application, or a surah that you can, if there's a surah you can recite for protection, or maybe one for healing, or that's how I'm reading the question. So apologies, Alfonso, if I'm totally not getting that right, but that's how I'm reading it.
Okay. Well, personally, I actually usually do go to Ayatul Kursi for protection, which is also very common. Although the Quls are also very traditional, but with respect to the previous question, you don't go wrong with Ayatul Kursi, and you're welcome to recite it multiple times or play it in the background and so forth. Yeah, and again, this is one of those blurred areas between what might be called occult or magical versus just normal orthodoxy. At least from a Shi'i perspective, a couple things that are quite common within the realm of orthodoxy. For Surah Al-Waqi'ah, which you can look up if you're not familiar with it, reciting it on Thursday nights is said to be good for staving off poverty or increasing wealth. And if you have a specific thing that you need, and you'll probably have to be a little bit motivated to do this, you wait for a month where the Islamic month starts on a Monday. So like the Islamic lunar calendar starts on a Monday. So that means on a Sunday night, you've seen the first crescent of the moon. Then for the first 14 days, you recite Surah Al-Waqi'ah according to the day number. So like day 1, you recite it 1 time, day 2, 2 times. It's the 14th day, you recite it 14 times, hence motivation. And then you ask for what you need, and inshallah, Allah will provide it. It does seem to work. So those are just things that sort of float around that are transmitted in the texts to apply sections of the Quran to practical uses. And I'm not entirely sure why, but if you were interested in employing the Quran for astral projection, I've been told that the ayah about that, like if all the oceans were ink and the trees were pens, the words of Allah would never run out. That can be employed to promote astral projecting. Maybe it's because oceans are about vastness or something. So sometimes, there are cases where these employments are very obvious, like you mentioned blowing on knots. So that's obviously protection against magic. And then there's also cases where it's not entirely clear what the link is. And then there's cases where maybe I just don't see it.
No, this is great, because I think anybody, listeners out there, and Alfonso, thank you for that question too, can go and look at the ayat, the verses of the Quran, and see about those potential applications. And thank you for sketching those out, Dr. Inloes. That's fantastic. And you were just mentioning Sufi orders and like having an organization or an order to belong to. So this last listener question for you talks about this kind of in the sense of the Shams al-Ma'arif. So Alfonso Parutz has a last question for you, which is, can you talk, Dr. Inloes, about the dangers and perils of exploring the Shams al-Ma'arif? Is it a grimoire or a work that needs guidance and initiation?
Deep question. I would say most things in life that are worthwhile have some sort of risk. Like sports or mountain climbing, martial arts. These things all come with serious risks. So you learn to take certain precautions at the beginning and you do your best. Although I'm not a good fighter by any means. I did a bit of training in Silat, which is a martial art in Malaysia and Indonesia, which has a bit more of a Sufi bent. And I remember we used to have to pray the protective prayers from the Quran at the beginning. And when I first started, I'm like, really need to pray these prayers. And then we got started. I'm like, yeah, it's brutal. That's why we say those prayers. And, people were getting injured and stuff. But anyway, the point is, it's anything with power should be approached with respect, but most things worth doing do have some element of risk. And it's just that the benefit is greater than the risk. When it comes to occult matters and unseen beings, I think a good rule of thumb is respect. It's not going to be the case that every unseen being you approach with respect will be respectful back. There are things that won't, but in general, it's definitely a good guideline, as opposed to just, maybe someone who's arrogant and just thinks they can command this and that, or they see something and they think they're having visions of God, or I saw the angel Jibrail, and maybe you saw I don't know what you saw. You saw something. So respect and humility are good starting points. And so with Shams al-Ma'arif or any other similar heavy work, I think having a teacher can have a couple. I'm going to list maybe 3 roles or advantages. Basic one is just to have someone to keep you grounded and keep you from, getting off into the clouds and losing it, which it can happen sometimes if people overdo it, or we've all seen it happen. Things happen. So there's that. But beyond that, to actually get this stuff to work, you need to be able to do what you need to do on an energetic and spiritual level beyond simply writing a talisman at the right time or saying the words. It might work if you just do that. But there's more that needs to go on. I think the analogy I would use is if you have like a world-class musician versus one of those computer music programs they used to have in the past. The computer music program will do it right, but it doesn't know how to engage in the form of channeling, if you will, that brings the art out from somewhere else. And that's something that is difficult to convey in a book. And it's just something, it's in part, I think you just need to figure it out, whether you're a musician or doing this sort of thing or any other form of art. But it's the less visible things, to get the engine running, so to speak. And also, there's basically going to be 2 types of teachers or more. You might add some more, but there are teachers who can teach you about the procedure. Like I just said, recite Surah Al-Waqi'ah. That's a procedure that I have taught. But to progress well, unless this is just something that's happened accidentally in your life through spirit contact or whatever, it's helpful to have a teacher that can link you to intelligences and beings outside of the visible realm. And not everyone can do that, but that's basically what an initiation is. So if I go and initiate into a Sufi order, it's not just a social contract that I'm saying I'm going to be loyal to you, but they are linking me to their lineage of sheikhs. And, I might start to have visions of them or some sort of contact or inspiration. So the point is they've connected me to something outside of the visible realm. And there are some people who are just born with those contacts. But for the rest of us, it's very helpful to have a teacher who's able to do that. And you might not know if someone's able to do that unless until after the fact. But I think that's really one of the advantages. And that's something that you can't get from a book alone, even if I think that dedicating yourself to the study of a book, it can link you to the current and the spirits of the book. But what I'm talking about is just a little bit of a step beyond that. So that can be very helpful. But if it's not there, then, you just get on with life and do whatever you do.
Again, these are really great general precepts that you're sharing, Dr. Inloes, and I know, Alfonso, I hope you do. I know I will just look at those and consider some of the things that you can do for those elements of protection and for thinking about orders and initiation. I love that analogy, by the way, Dr. Inloes, on the musical instrument. It's such a great point. Like, technically, all the notes are there, but something's lost. It's very flat. Pardon the musical pun, but it's very much like
it's not sharp.
It's not sharp. Okay, there you go. You perfect. Well said. So thank you for that. And I know, Dr. Inloes, we have a very brief after show where you might go into more detail about this. But as we wrap up the main podcast, can you tell us two things? Number one, of course, how can listeners check out and support you and your work? And of course, and we'll link to your academia.edu page, and we'll link to the Shams al-Ma'arif from 2021, Revelor Press. Definitely check that out, listeners. But how can listeners support you and your work? And can you give us any hints on future work or future projects that you're working on?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of a location, my academia.edu page is the best. I usually update it when new stuff comes out. For articles and book chapters, if I'm able to post it without violating a copyright agreement, I will. If not, email me, and I'm sure I can send you a copy of an article or a chapter within the fair use clause of copyright law. It can be difficult to balance these ethical imperatives. At future work, I recently wrote a chapter on jinn and UFOs.
That is fascinating. Can you please give us a little hint about that? Any more details? That's great.
Sure. It's for a book on UFOs and religion. So I got the Islamic slot. And it actually took me a while to figure out what to do, but I ended up taking a Shi'i perspective. And that's in part because, although UFO phenomenon may or may not be extraterrestrials, there's also a fair amount of Shi'i Hadith that here to deal with extraterrestrial beings. So I go through that, and then I go through talking about jinn and UFO phenomena and how they intersect. So that seems like it's actually something that might come out fairly quickly. Unfortunately, academic publishing can be a bit slow, but this does seem to be reasonably on track. I guess there's a lot of people interested in UFOs out there. So that was interesting to write. What else am I doing?
Well, I know in the after show. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just thinking. So there's that. I mean, on a broader level, ideally, I'd like to bring this stuff about Shi'ism and the occult tradition into a book. It just kind of hasn't taken form yet. But I have been writing articles on different topics. So I'm hoping that they'll kind of reach that critical mass phase where I'll just kind of feel that it's become booky now. And I can, you just need like a kernel or a seed to really focus a book on, and I feel like I haven't quite got that yet.
Gotcha. Well, to that very point, we will certainly keep our ear to the ground on any movements on that in the coming months or coming years, Dr. Inloes. But your voice, speaking of voices and voices that need to be because there can be other traditions, or as you touched on earlier, a lot of loudness out there and funding and things like that. I am so thankful for your voice, because the work that you've done with the Shamsa Ma'arif, I've heard from so many listeners who have appreciated you bringing this into the mainstream, for the English-speaking world. And that's only, I know, one part of your research, but also in the research today, the 2 articles that we discussed. I am so thankful for your voice and helping to illuminate the heterodox, complex, nuanced tradition with the Twelver Shi Hadith corpus and taking all of the historical elements. So I really want to thank you, Dr. Inloes, for taking the time and sharing with the listeners about all of the complexities and the nuance today. Just really, really appreciate you, because your voice is just so important. So thank you. Yeah,
I appreciate that. That means a lot to me, because, like I said, these subjects can sometimes be a bit niche or a bit obscure. So, if this has been meaningful to people, then my job is done.
Absolutely. Certainly for me, and I know for the listeners too. I try not to speak on behalf of the listeners, but I can certainly say that we're very, very thankful. Scholar, researcher, educator, public speaker, discussing the Twelver Shi Hadith corpus, but also with the 2021 Revelor Press Shamsa Ma'arif translation of the first 8 chapters and more, as well as so many other topics. Really appreciate it. Dr. Amina Inloes, thank you for stopping by the podcast today.
Thank you for having me here.